Rikers Island isn't just a jail. It's a world of chaos, violence, and survival. Hidden in plain sight in New York City, it's been called a human rights crisis by federal monitors and a ticking time bomb by reform advocates. From deadly stabbings to brutal guard beatings, from smuggled drugs to inmate suicides, Rikers has become a symbol of everything broken in America's jail system. Today, we're going inside the walls of one of the most notorious jails on Earth to uncover why it's been called America's most dangerous jail. Rikers Island sits in the East River, wedged between the Bronx and Queens. At first glance, it doesn't look like the epicenter of brutality. It's just a strip of land, about 400 acres, connected to the city by a single narrow bridge. But step past the gates, and you enter a place that has been compared to a war zone. The jail opened in the 1930s as a replacement for Manhattan's overcrowded Tombs. At the time, reformers promised Rikers would be a more humane environment. Instead, it became a dumping ground for New York's most troubled populations, people awaiting trial who couldn't afford bail, addicts, the mentally ill, and those convicted of misdemeanors. By the 1980s and 1990s, as crime surged across New York City, Rikers became infamous for violence. Journalists who visited described open-air dormitories where hundreds of men slept inches apart, with little supervision. Gangs like the Bloods and Latin Kings quickly carved up control of housing units. Correction officers, many poorly trained and overworked, often looked the other way or joined in the violence themselves. One notorious case came in 2007 when 18-year-old Christopher Robinson was beaten to death by other inmates in a housing unit at Rikers. Investigators later discovered that officers had set up what they called the program, a system where they allowed certain inmates to act as enforcers, controlling others through intimidation and violence. In exchange, those enforcers kept order, sparing officers from doing their jobs. Robinson's death exposed this underground system to the public, sparking outrage but little real change. Conditions at Rikers only grew worse in the 2010s. Reports from the New York Times and Human Rights Watch documented cases of inmates locked in cells without medical care or forced to live in units overrun with vermin and filth. Inmates with mental illnesses often ended up in solitary confinement, where they deteriorated further. Suicide attempts soared. In 2014, the case of Kalief Browder brought international attention to Rikers. Browder was just 16 when he was sent there after being accused of stealing a backpack. He spent 3 years on the island awaiting trial, 2 of those years in solitary confinement. Browder endured countless beatings from both inmates and guards. Eventually, charges against him were dropped, but the psychological damage was irreversible. In 2015, at the age of 22, he took his own life. His story became a rallying cry for activists who demanded the closure of Rikers. But even as lawsuits like Nunes v. City of New York forced the city to agree to sweeping reforms, like ending excessive force and improving supervision, the violence didn't stop. A 2021 Federal Monitor report revealed at least 15 deaths that year alone, many tied to stabbings, overdoses, or medical neglect. The report described a system in a state of crisis, with staffing shortages so severe that inmates were sometimes left locked in intake pens for days without food, water, or access to toilets. What makes Rikers unique and so dangerous isn't just the violence. It's the combination of overcrowding, poor oversight, and the fact that most people held there haven't even been convicted of a crime. They are awaiting trial, often, and for months or years, trapped in a place described by the Department of Justice as deeply entrenched in a culture of violence. From the outside, Rikers Island is just another piece of New York City. Inside, it's a pressure cooker, one where desperation, power struggles, and neglect explode into daily chaos. And for decades, despite reforms, lawsuits, and billions in city funding, the island remains one of the darkest corners of America's justice system. If Chapter 1 revealed Rikers as an island of the forgotten, then Chapter 2 uncovers the power structures that truly run the jail: gangs, smuggling networks, and the uneasy alliances between inmates and officers. For decades, Rikers has been described not as a jail run by the Department of Correction, but as one divided into fiefdoms ruled by gangs. The Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, Trinitarios, and Nitas have all had strong footholds inside. Their influence extends beyond the housing units, reaching into visitation rooms, commissaries, and even the correctional staff themselves. The 2014 U.S. Department of Justice investigation into Rikers painted a stark picture. Inmates lived in a constant state of fear. The report detailed that stabbings and slashings were not isolated events but part of daily life, often tied to disputes over drugs, tobacco, and control of stores. Informal inmate-run businesses where commissary goods like ramen noodles or honey buns became currency. Contraband was the bloodstream of this underground economy. Despite the island's isolation, drugs, weapons, and cell phones flowed freely inside. Sometimes they came in through corrupt correction officers, willing to smuggle in heroin or razors for cash. In other cases, visitors and even delivery trucks were caught slipping contraband past weak security systems. A 2015 New York Times investigation uncovered just how systemic the problem was. Hundreds of officers had been disciplined or arrested for smuggling, bribery, or brutality. In one shocking case, officers were paid thous, sands of dollars to bring in scalpels, which were then used in slashings that left inmates permanently scarred. Federal prosecutors later described Rikers as an institution where lawlessness reigned. This environment fueled cycles of violence. Control of contraband determined power. Inmates who managed to secure drugs or blades gained leverage, and those who resisted often became targets. The gangs enforced order through fear, and officers, instead of breaking up the power structures, sometimes played both sides. Some correctional officers aligned with certain gangs, trading protection for loyalty. Others deliberately pitted rival groups against each other, believing chaos kept the population in check. The infamous program, exposed after Christopher Robinson's death, was not an anomaly. Multiple lawsuits alleged that officers routinely deputized inmates as enforcers, giving them access to weapons or privileges in exchange for controlling others. Human Rights Watch documented cases where these inmate enforcers carried out assaults while officers stood by, turning Rikers into what one judge called a Lord of the Flies scenario. The violence wasn't limited to inmates. Officers themselves were often victims. In 2021 alone, the Correction Officers Benevolent Association reported more than 500 attacks on staff, many involving slashings with smuggled blades. Officers described working conditions as inhumane, 12 to 16-hour shifts, understaffed housing units, and no backup when fights broke out. One officer told federal monitors, "Every day feels like going to war, and most of the time, we're losing." The cycle repeated endlessly. Contraband fueled gangs. Gangs fueled violence. Violence fueled fear. Fear fueled corruption, as officers sought to survive by cutting deals. In this way, Rikers became less a correctional facility and more a self-sustaining ecosystem of crime. Reform after reform attempted to cut into the cycle, installing body scanners, increasing surveillance cameras, and promising stricter oversight. But the smuggling continued. By 2022, reports showed that despite millions invested, drugs like fentanyl were still reaching inmates in alarming amounts, leading to overdoses and deaths inside the jail. The dominance of gangs and contraband has shaped the daily reality of Rikers. It is a place where survival often depends on alliances, where trust is rare, and where every interaction carries the shadow of violence. For many inside, the question is not whether you will face violence, but when. If gangs and contraband control the body of Rikers, then solitary confinement is where the jail wages war on the mind. Known on the island as the Bing, solitary confinement has long been one of the most feared punishments for inmates, a place where time itself becomes torture. For decades, inmates at Rikers who broke rules, or who were simply accused of violence, were sent to solitary units for days, months, even years at a time. These cells were small concrete boxes, barely large enough for a bed and a toilet. Inmates were confined 23 hours a day, with 1 hour, sometimes less, for exercise in tiny outdoor pens. The lights often never dimmed. The silence was broken only by the sound of guards' boots, or the screams of others losing their grip on reality. Studies have shown that solitary confinement can trigger or worsen mental illness, and at Rikers, this reality was unavoidable. A 2014 investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice found that teenagers were regularly placed in solitary, sometimes for minor infractions. Many of these young inmates already struggled with mental health conditions. Instead of treatment, they were isolate. Left to spiral into despair. The story of Kalief Browder, which shook the nation, is the clearest window into this cruelty. Arrested at 16 for allegedly stealing a backpack, Browder spent 3 years at Rikers awaiting trial. For 2 of those years, he was held in solitary confinement. Surveillance footage later showed him being assaulted by guards and other inmates, while his pleas for help went ignored. The isolation broke him. Although he was eventually released after charges were dropped, Browder was haunted by his time in the Bing. In 2015, he took his own life, a tragic symbol of how solitary confinement at Rikers destroys young lives. Rikers has long claimed solitary is necessary to maintain order, but critics argue the practice became a crutch for a broken system. Instead of addressing underlying issues, overcrowding, staff shortages, gang control, officers leaned on solitary as the easiest way to remove problem inmates from the general population. It was punishment first, rehabilitation never. The toll has been staggering. Human Rights Watch reported that a disproportionate number of inmates who committed suicide at Rikers had recently been in solitary. In 2013, the New York City Board of Correction revealed that nearly 40% of adolescents at Rikers were held in isolation at some point. Psychiatric experts like Dr. Stuart Gracian, a Harvard psychiatrist who testified in multiple lawsuits, described solitary as a form of psychological torture that causes hallucinations, paranoia, depression, and self-harm. Lawsuits followed. In Nunes v. City of New York, plaintiffs argued that solitary confinement was part of a broader culture of excessive force and cruel punishment. Under public pressure, the city announced reforms, ending solitary for teenagers in 2014, and later pledging to end it for inmates under 21. In 2021, the New York City Council passes a bill to restrict its use further, though critics say punitive segregation still exists under different names. Yet, despite these reforms, stories continue to surface. Inmates describe being locked in intake pens for days, sometimes weeks, without showers, beds, or medical care, a form of de facto solitary. In 2021, federal monitors documented multiple deaths linked to neglect in these units. Some men hanged themselves with bed sheets after days of isolation. Others overdosed while guards failed to intervene. The war on the mind at Rikers is not just about solitary, it's about neglect. Nearly half of the jail's population suffers from some form of mental illness, according to city data. Yet psychiatric services are stretched thin, and officers often lack training to respond. The result is a cycle. Inmates act out due to untreated illness, they are thrown into solitary as punishment, and their conditions worsen. This cycle doesn't just destroy individuals, it infects the entire system. Correction officers, many under extreme stress themselves, face constant confrontations with mentally ill inmates. Violence escalates. And as violence escalates, solitary is used more, even though everyone knows it fuels the very chaos it's supposed to control. At Rikers, solitary confinement isn't just a policy. It's a scar that defines the institution. It reveals how the jail treats human suffering, not with care, but with concrete walls and locked doors. And it raises a haunting question. How much damage has already been done to the thousands who passed through those cells, forgotten by the outside world? For years, Rikers has been the focus of courtrooms, commissions, and headlines. Yet despite mountains of lawsuits, federal monitors, and promises of reform, the violence and neglect continue. To understand why, we need to look at how the law has collided with the brutal reality inside those walls. One of the most significant legal moments came in Nunes v. City of New York, a federal class action lawsuit filed in 2011. Inmates alleged a pervasive culture of violence at Rikers, pointing to widespread beatings by officers, excessive use of solitary confinement, and a lack of accountability. By 2015, the case resulted in a sweeping consent decree. The city agreed to bring in a federal monitor, improve staff training, install more cameras, and adopt new policies to curb the abuse. On paper, it sounded like a turning point. But in practice, progress was slow and often undermined. Monitors reported that staff continued to use headshots, blows to the head, against inmates, a tactic long banned due to the risk of brain injury. Slashings and stabbings remained high, fueled by smuggled weapons. In 2021, a monitor's report described Rikers as dangerously out of control, warning that conditions posed an imminent risk of harm to both inmates and staff. Other lawsuits piled up. Families of inmates who died inside sued the city for negligence. In 2022 alone, at least 19 people died at Rikers, the highest toll in decades. Causes ranged from suicide to drug overdoses to medical neglect. In one case, a man was found dead after guards failed to check on him for hours. In another, an inmate with mental illness choked to death while restrained. Each case became a headline, each lawsuit a reminder that the crisis was far from solved. Oversight bodies, too, issued damning reports. The New York City Board of Correction, an independent watchdog, repeatedly flagged violations of minimum standards. Inmates held for days in intake cells without beds or showers, shortages of medical staff, and rampant violence. Federal judges grew increasingly impatient, warning that the city risked losing control of its own jail system if it couldn't fix Rikers. This mounting pressure fed into the growing movement to close Rikers entirely. Activists, politicians, and community groups rallied under the banner of Close Rikers, arguing that the facility was beyond reform. They pointed to Kalief Browder's case as the ultimate example of why the jail could not be fixed. In 2017, then-Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a historic plan. Rikers would be shut down by 2027, replaced by smaller, borough-based jails meant to be safer and more modern. But closing Rikers has been anything but simple. Critics argue the city has dragged its feet, investing billions into patchwork reforms while the jail remains open. The COVID-19 pandemic only made things worse. With staff shortages and overcrowding, conditions spiraled into chaos. In 2021, viral photos showed inmates packed into intake pens, forced to sleep on floors surrounded by trash and human waste. Public outrage reignited calls for closure. Federal authorities have also raised the stakes. In 2022, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams warned that if the city couldn't fix Rikers, the federal government might seek a court-appointed receiver to take control of the jail. This move would effectively strip New York City of its authority, placing the facility under federal management. It would be a rare and dramatic step, underscoring just how dire the situation has become. Through all of this, the human toll has never stopped. Each lawsuit represents lives lost or scarred, sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers who entered Rikers but never left. Each monitor's report tells the same story: promises made, promises broken, and a jail that remains a humanitarian crisis in the heart of New York City. The fight to close Rikers isn't just about shutting down a building. It's about dismantling a culture of neglect and violence that has festered for decades. It's about acknowledging that no amount of money, oversight, or reform can erase the scars already left behind. And yet, the question hangs heavy. Will Rikers truly close? Or will history repeat itself, with promises made while thousands remain trapped in America's most dangerous jail? Statistics and lawsuits can show the scale of the crisis, but they don't capture the raw human cost of life on Rikers. To understand its true impact, you need to listen to those who lived through it, officers, families, and former inmates whose stories reveal a daily reality of fear, loss, and survival. Take the case of Officer Martha King, who worked at Rikers for over 15 years. In interviews, she described the job as like going into combat every day. Understaffing meant she was often responsible for supervising 60 or more inmates by herself. Fights could break out in seconds, and backup sometimes never arrived. King recalled one night when she was cornered by inmates in a housing unit. "I had my radio, but nobody came. I thought I was going to die there." Officers like her say they are trapped between two impossible realities: fearing for their safety from inmates and facing discipline or lawsuits if they use too much force. Then there are the families, those who wait on the outside while loved ones endure the chaos inside. In 2021, The family of Brandon Rodriguez mourned publicly after the 25-year-old was found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide just 1 week after being admitted to Rikers. His mother told reporters, "He needed help, not punishment. They left him to die." Her words echoed the pain of countless families who say Rikers stole their loved ones long before trial or conviction ever took place. For former inmates, the scars often never heal. Victor Dempsey, who spent years inside, described Rikers as a place where you stop being human. He remembered sleeping on the floor of intake pens for days without food or water, surrounded by men fighting over space. You hear people screaming all night. You don't know if it's from a beating or if someone's losing their mind. You just pray you make it out. Dempsey now speaks at rallies demanding closure of the jail, saying he owes his survival to luck, not justice. Another haunting story comes from Kalief Browder's brother, Akeem, who became an activist after Kalief's suicide. He has spoken at rallies and on national television, reminding the world that his brother's death was not an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a broken system. "How many Kaliefs are still in there right now?" he asked. His voice turned personal grief into a movement, but his question remains unanswered. Even the Guards Union has shared stories of trauma. The Correction Officers Benevolent Association has reported hundreds of injuries every year. Officers describe colleagues who developed PTSD, substance abuse problems, and depression from the constant violence. "We're told to keep order, but there is no order," one officer admitted. "We're prisoners too, just in uniform." These human stories make it impossible to see Rikers as just another jail. They reveal a system where both inmates and staff are broken down by the same conditions: violence, neglect, and hopelessness. They also highlight the ripple effects beyond the island. Families are shattered, communities carry the burden, and the city spends billions on a facility that continues to fail. What makes these stories even more tragic is that most people at Rikers are not serving long sentences. They are pretrial detainees, legally innocent, but trapped because they cannot afford bail. Theirs are there for short stints, serving sentences of a year or less. Yet their lives are forever changed by time on the island. Some never make it out alive. It is through these voices that Rikers' true identity emerges, not just as a failing institution, but as a human catastrophe. Every statistic hides a face. Every lawsuit hides a family's grief. And every story adds to the chorus calling for Rikers' end. For all the violence, lawsuits, and scandals, one fact about Rikers often shocks people the most: how much it costs to keep the jail running. Each year, New York City spends billions maintaining the facility. In 2021, city budget data revealed it cost more than $500,000 per inmate per year, making Rikers one of the most expensive jails in the world. That staggering number isn't because inmates are treated well. Instead, it reflects a bloated system riddled with inefficiency, corruption, and crisis management. Massive overtime payments to correctional staff, multi-million-dollar legal settlements from lawsuits, and endless contracts for medical services, food, and maintenance drive the costs sky high. Yet despite the spending, conditions remain abysmal: overcrowding, vermin infestations, and chronic shortages of basic supplies. The economics of Rikers expose a bitter paradox. New York taxpayers are paying luxury hotel rates for inmates to live in squalor. Families of the incarcerated, meanwhile, often shoulder crushing costs just to stay connected, paying steep prices for phone calls, commissary goods, and transportation to the remote island. For communities already struggling with poverty, Rikers becomes not just a punishment for inmates, but a financial burden on their loved ones. Reform efforts have consumed billions more. Since the Nunes settlement, New York City has invested heavily in cameras, staff training, and oversight programs. Yet federal monitors report that violence remains at near-record levels. In other words, the city has poured money into reforms without addressing the core problem: the culture of neglect and brutality that defines Rikers. Even the plan to close Rikers comes with an enormous price tag. Estimates for building smaller borough-based jails run into tens of billions of dollars. Critics argue the city could spend less by focusing on alternatives to incarceration, like bail reform, community programs, and mental health treatment. But so far, political battles and bureaucratic delays have stalled real change. The economics of Rikers reveal what activists have long argued: The jail is not just a humanitarian disaster, but a financial one. Every year it remains open. New York pays more money for more suffering, and the cycle continues. Rikers Island stands as a symbol of America's broken justice system. For nearly a century, it has been a place where violence thrives, where human lives are devalued, and where billions are spent to maintain misery. Lawsuits, reforms, and promises of closure have all failed to end the crisis. For the officers, it is a battlefield. For the inmates, it is survival. For families, it is heartbreak. And for the city, it is a moral and financial wound that refuses to heal. The question is no longer whether Rikers should close, it's whether New York has the will to let it go. Until then, behind the barbed wire and concrete walls, the chaos continues. And every day, new stories are written inside America's most dangerous jail.